The parking lot was dimly lit, with just a few scattered streetlights casting long shadows over the rows of cars. Rachel Carter, a fire safety inspector in her early 30s, had just finished a long day ensuring local businesses met safety standards. She wasn't looking for trouble, she never was. Her focus had been on doing her job, checking fire extinguishers, emergency exits, and sprinklers. But as she packed up her gear and walked toward her truck, she noticed a figure approaching, and trouble was exactly what found her. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, was dressed in a police uniform. His name tag read, Officer Ethan. He exuded authority, but there was something unsettling about his demeanor, something that immediately set Rachel on edge. His eyes weren't those of a man interested in protecting or serving. Instead, they seemed to burn with something darker, something dangerous. "Hey," he called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "What are you doing out here?" Rachel turned, keeping her tone calm and professional. "I'm finishing an inspection. I work with Metro Fire Safety Consultants. I was just about to leave." She reached into her pocket to retrieve her ID badge, but before she could show it, Ethan stepped closer, his face tightening. "Inspection?" "At this hour?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Rachel felt her heart rate pick up, but forced herself to stay composed. "Yes, some inspections happen after hours to avoid disrupting business operations. Everything's legitimate. I can show you my paperwork if you'd like." But Ethan wasn't interested in paperwork. He crossed his arms, his stance widening. "This doesn't feel right to me. You've got equipment in that truck that could be anything. I think we need to investigate this further." Rachel's eyes narrowed. She'd dealt with difficult people before, but there was something different about this interaction. "Officer, I assure you, everything I have is for fire safety. You're welcome to take a look, but I'd prefer to wrap this up and head home." Ethan's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no humor in it. "You don't get to tell me what I'm welcome to do. Step back and let me handle this." The tension in the air thickened. Rachel's instincts told her to tread carefully, but she also knew she couldn't let this escalate. She raised her hands slightly, a gesture of peace. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I just want to finish my day." But Ethan wasn't backing down. To him, this wasn't about safety or protocol. It was about control. And as Rachel stood her ground, his frustration grew. "You're resisting me," he snapped, his voice rising. "I'm not resisting anything," Rachel replied, her voice steady but firm. "I'm just asking you to respect my work and let me leave." Ethan stepped closer, his hand hovering near his utility belt. Rachel felt a flicker of unease. Was he really going to escalate this over nothing? She decided to try reasoning with him one last time. "Officer, I respect the work you do. But there's no need for this. Let's just de-escalate the situation." But Ethan didn't hear her. Or maybe he didn't want to. To him, her calm demeanor was a challenge, one he couldn't ignore. His voice lowered, menacing now. "You think you're smarter than me? That you can just walk away from this?" Rachel's stomach sank. She knew where this was heading, and it wasn't good. She glanced around the parking lot, but there were no witnesses in sight. No one to intervene if things went wrong. What Ethan didn't realize was that Rachel wasn't just someone he could intimidate. She had faced adversity before and had learned how to stay composed under pressure. As his aggression grew, so did her determination to stand her ground. She wouldn't let fear dictate her actions, not this time. The sound of fire extinguisher dropping to the ground echoed through the parking lot, snapping both of them out of their standoff. Rachel glanced at the extinguisher near her feet, then back at Ethan, whose hand now rested firmly on his baton. The air crackled with tension as the moment of truth loomed closer. And then, just as Ethan took a step forward, something shifted in Rachel's expression. A spark of resolve, a decision made in an instant. She wouldn't let this end the way he wanted. If he thought she was just going to roll over, he was in for a surprise. The camera pans to Rachel's clenched fists and Ethan's tightening grip on his baton as the screen fades to black, leaving the audience on the edge of their seats. What happens next will change everything. Rachel's pulse quickened as she locked eyes with Ethan. Her instincts screamed at her to remain calm, to avoid giving him any reason to escalate further. But the fire in his gaze told her he was looking for that reason, and she wasn't about to hand it to him. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing second. The distant hum of a passing car did nothing to break the oppressive tension. Ethan finally broke the silence. "I'm giving you one last chance. Step away from the truck, keep your hands where I can see them, and don't argue." His words came out slow and deliberate, as if he were trying to savor the power he thought he held over her. Rachel didn't move. She knew better than to make any sudden gestures that could be misinterpreted. Instead, she spoke with the same measured calm she'd been using all along. "Officer, I'm not trying to argue. My hands are visible, and I've complied with everything you've asked so far. Let me explain." "I didn't ask for an explanation," Ethan barked, cutting her off. His voice echoed through the parking lot, startling a bird that fluttered off a nearby lamppost. "I'm in charge here. You do as I say. Got it?" Rachel took a slow breath, steadying herself. She could feel her frustration bubbling beneath the surface, but she pushed it down. She had learned long ago that anger wasn't a weapon. It was a liability. Ethan, however, seemed to be feeding off his own aggression, letting it guide his every move. She decided to try another approach. "I understand you have a job to do, officer," she said carefully. "I'm just asking you to see that I'm not a threat. I work for Metro Fire Safety Consultants, and my equipment is all standard issue. I'm happy to provide any documentation you need." But Ethan wasn't interested in documentation. His eyes narrowed, and he took another step closer, closing the gap between them. "You think you can just throw some fancy words at me and make this go away? You think you're smarter than me?" His tone was mocking now, his voice rising with every word. Rachel stayed silent this time. She could see that reasoning with him was futile, and she needed to think strategically. Her mind raced through her options. She could call for help, but Ethan was standing close enough to grab her phone if she reached for it. She could try to walk away, but something told her he wouldn't let her go that easily. As she weighed her choices, her thoughts drifted to a memory from a few years earlier. She had been attending a fire safety training seminar, and one of the speakers, a retired fire marshal, had taught about the importance of staying calm in high-pressure situations. "Control what you can control," he had said. "The moment you panic, you've already lost." Rachel reminded herself of those words now. She couldn't control Ethan's behavior, but she could control her own. She forced herself to relax her shoulders and unclench her fists, showing him that she wasn't intimidated, even though deep down she was. Ethan seemed to notice the shift in her demeanor, and it only seemed to agitate him further. "You're awfully quiet all of a sudden," he sneered. "What's the matter? Got nothing to say now?" Rachel looked him straight in the eye, her voice steady. "I'm just trying to de-escalate this, officer. That's all." But her composure only seemed to fuel his anger. Ethan's hand moved to his baton, and for a moment Rachel thought he might actually use it. Her breath caught in her throat as she braced herself for what might come next. Then, out of nowhere, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Everything okay over here?" Rachel and Ethan both turned toward the sound. A man in his late 40s, wearing a security guard uniform, was walking toward them from the direction of a nearby building. He had a flashlight in one hand and a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. Ethan's expression shifted instantly, the smirk disappearing from his face. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped, his tone curt. The security guard raised an eyebrow, unfazed by Ethan's hostility. "I'm in charge of security for this lot," he said evenly. "When I see something going down, it does concern me. So, what's going on here?" Rachel seized the opportunity. "I was just finishing up an inspection when the officer stopped me," she explained quickly. "He seemed to think there was something suspicious about my work." Ethan shot her a glare, but the security guard didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. "Inspection, huh?" he said, turning to Rachel. You got ID? Rachel nodded and reached into her pocket, moving slowly to avoid alarming either man. She pulled out her work badge and handed it to the security guard, who examined it closely. Metro Fire Safety Consultants, he read aloud. He glanced at her truck, then back at the badge. Looks legit to me. Ethan's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. She could forge that, he muttered. The security guard frowned. Come on, officer. You really think someone's going to go to all that trouble just to run a scan in a parking lot? I've seen her type before. She's just trying to do her job. Ethan's face darkened, but he didn't respond. Rachel could feel the power dynamic shifting, and for the first time since the encounter began, she felt a flicker of hope. The security guard handed her badge back to her and turned to Ethan. If you've got no real evidence of wrongdoing, maybe it's time to let her go. No sense in making a big deal out of nothing. Ethan hesitated, his hand still resting on his baton. Rachel could see the wheels turning in his head, his pride battling against the reality of the situation. Finally, he took a step back, his expression hard. Fine, he said through gritted teeth, but don't think this is over. Rachel didn't respond. She knew better than to provoke him further. Instead, she nodded her thanks to the security guard and began gathering her equipment, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline started to wear off. As she loaded the last of her gear into the truck, she felt Ethan's eyes on her, burning with a mix of anger and humiliation. She didn't look back, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing any fear or uncertainty in her face. Instead, she climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot without a word. But as she drove away, her mind was racing. This wasn't just an isolated incident, she realized. Ethan's behavior wasn't about her. It was about something much bigger, and she wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. The camera lingers on Rachel's face as she grips the steering wheel, her jaw set with determination. The tension may have subsided for now, but the real battle was just beginning. As Rachel drove through the quiet streets, her thoughts churned. The encounter with Ethan had shaken her, but had also ignited a fire inside her. She couldn't stop replaying the events in her head. The way he had dismissed her, the smug tone in his voice, the way he seemed to relish the power imbalance. It wasn't just about her job or the equipment in her truck. It was about something deeper, something systemic. And she knew she couldn't just walk away from it. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her, jolting her out of her thoughts. She pulled over to check the screen and saw a text from her best friend Mia. Asterisk, you good? Heard about some drama at the lot. Call me when you can asterisk. Rachel sighed. Mia worked as a dispatcher for a private security firm, and she seemed to have an uncanny ability to hear about things before they made the rounds. Rachel dialed her number, knowing she couldn't keep this to herself. You okay? Mia's voice came through the line, laced with concern. I'm fine, Rachel said, though her voice wavered slightly. Just had a run-in with a cop who decided to flex his authority on the wrong person. Mia let out a low whistle. What happened? Rachel recounted the encounter, sparing no detail. Mia was silent for a moment after Rachel finished, then let out a sharp breath. That's messed up. You know this isn't just about tonight, right? Guys like him don't stop until someone makes them. Rachel knew Mia was right, but what could she do? She was just one person, and Ethan clearly thrived on intimidation. She thought about the security guard who had stepped in. Without his intervention, things could have escalated even further. Mia, have you ever heard of Officer Ethan? Rachel hesitated, realizing she didn't even know his last name. He's mid-30s, tall, kind of stocky. But's cut. Really aggressive. Hold on, Mia said. Rachel could hear her typing on a keyboard. Let me see what I can pull up. You said this was in the Eastgate lot, right? Yeah. Rachel gripped the steering wheel, waiting as Mia worked her magic. Got it, Mia said after a moment. Officer Ethan Mallory. He's been with the department for about 10 years. And wow. What? There's a whole list of complaints against him. Use of excessive force, racial profiling, misconduct during traffic stops. Most of them were investigated and dismissed, but it's a pattern. Mia's tone grew serious. Rachel, this guy isn't just a jerk. He's dangerous. Rachel's stomach twisted. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through her. She couldn't let this slide, not when it was clear Ethan had a history of abusing his authority. I don't want to let this go, Rachel said quietly. But I don't know where to start. You're not alone in this, Maya said firmly. There are people who can help. Activists, legal aid organizations, even some journalists. If you want to make noise, we'll find a way. Rachel felt a surge of gratitude. Mia had always been in her corner, and knowing she had someone to lean on made the situation feel a little less overwhelming. The next morning, Rachel woke up early, determined to take action. She spent hours researching Ethan's history, combing through local news articles and public records. The more she uncovered, the more appalled she became. Ethan's name was linked to multiple incidents, but nothing ever seemed to stick. Witnesses would back out, evidence would go missing, and the department would issue vague statements about procedural reviews. It was a sickeningly familiar pattern. By mid-afternoon, Rachel's laptop screen was filled with tabs, each one a piece of a puzzle she was trying to assemble. She jotted down notes, highlighting key incidents and timelines. But the more she delved into the details, the more questions arose. Why had Ethan been allowed to stay on the force for so long? Who was protecting him? She decided to reach out to a local journalist named Daniel Ruse, whose articles on police accountability had made waves in the community. She sent him a carefully worded email, outlining her encounter with Ethan and the information she had uncovered. Within an hour, Daniel responded, asking to meet in person. That evening, Rachel found herself sitting across from Daniel in a cozy coffee shop. He was younger than she had expected, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "This is heavy stuff," Daniel said after Rachel finished recounting her story. "But if we're going to expose him, we need more. Testimonies, records, anything that can paint a clear picture." Rachel nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes. I just want him to be held accountable." Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. "You realize this won't be easy, right? People like Mallory don't go down without a fight. And the system that protects him. It's not going to make this easy for you." "I'm not afraid," Rachel said, though she wasn't sure if it was entirely true. "If we don't do something, he'll keep getting away with it." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's the spirit. Let's get to work." As they began brainstorming a plan, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something much bigger than herself. But for the first time since her encounter with Ethan, she felt a sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but she was ready to face it head-on. As the days turned into a week, Rachel found herself immersed in a whirlwind of research, interviews, and late-night calls with Daniel. The pieces of Ethan Mallory's past were coming together, each one more damning than the last. Daniel had managed to secure a few anonymous testimonies from individuals who claimed to have been targeted by Mallory, their stories echoing Rachel's experience. Each account painted a picture of a man who operated with impunity, hiding behind his badge and the thin veneer of departmental loyalty. But as they dug deeper, the stakes began to rise. One evening, Rachel noticed a car idling outside her apartment building. It wasn't an unfamiliar sight. Parking was tight in her neighborhood. But something about the way the car remained there for hours made her uneasy. The next day, her email was flooded with spam, her phone buzzing non-stop with unknown numbers. It was subtle at first, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, trying to rattle her. She mentioned it to Mia during one of their calls. "I feel like I'm being paranoid, but it's likely no." Mia didn't hesitate. "You're not imagining things. People like Mallory, they've got connections, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect their own. Be careful, Rachel." Daniel shared similar concerns when Rachel brought it up. "It's a risk, but it also means we're onto something big. They wouldn't bother intimidating you if they weren't scared." The thought offered little comfort. Still, Rachel pressed on, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. She began documenting everything: the car outside her building, the strange calls, even the moments when she felt like someone was following her. Daniel suggested she invest in a small home security system, just to be safe. Then came the breakthrough. One of Daniel's contacts, a former officer who had left the force after clashing with Mallory, agreed to meet with them. The man, whose name was Marcus, had a weary look about him, his eyes shadowed with the weight of what he'd seen during his years on the job. "I've seen guys like Mallory before," Marcus said, his voice low and measured. "They thrive in a system that rewards silence. The complaints, they go straight to internal affairs, and 9 times out of 10, they get buried. It's like a black hole. Once something goes in, it's gone." Rachel listened intently as Marcus detailed how Mallory had skirted accountability for years. There was one incident, Marcus said, leaning forward. "A few years back, Mallory pulled over a young black man for a busted taillight. It should have been routine, but it escalated. The guy ended up in the hospital. Mallory claimed self-defense, but the body cam footage disappeared before the investigation." Rachel's pulse quickened. "Do you think we can find anything on that case?" Marcus hesitated. "Maybe, but you're going to need more than just my word. The department's going to fight tooth and nail to keep this buried." The next few days were a blur of phone calls and emails. Daniel managed to track down the victim from the taillight incident, a man named Andra, who had since moved out of state. After some convincing, Andra agreed to speak with them. His voice trembled as he recounted the night that had left him with physical and emotional scars. "He pulled me over like I was some kind of criminal," Andra said, his anger barely contained. "When I tried to explain myself, he slammed me against the car. I wasn't resisting, but he kept shouting like I was some kind of threat. Next thing I know, I'm on the ground, and he's got his knee on my back." Rachel felt a knot form in her stomach. Andra's story was chillingly familiar, a reminder of how often these encounters ended in tragedy. Andra had tried to file a complaint, but he was met with the same wall of silence that Rachel had encountered. Despite the mounting evidence, Rachel and Daniel knew they were walking a fine line. They needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be dismissed or discredited. And then, almost by accident, they found it. While combing through public records, Rachel stumbled across a financial disclosure form linked to Mallory. It seemed innocuous at first, but a closer look revealed discrepancies. Payments from an untraceable account, amounts that didn't match his salary or standard allowances. Daniel's eyes widened when he saw it. "This could be it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If we can prove he's taking bribes or funneling money, it'll blow this wide open." The discovery felt like a turning point, but it also came with a sense of foreboding. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting too close, that Mallory, or whoever was protecting him, would retaliate. Her fears were confirmed when she returned home one evening to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside, every nerve on edge. Nothing appeared to be missing, but her laptop had been moved, the screen glowing faintly. A quick check revealed that someone had tried, and failed, to access her files. Rachel called Daniel and Mia immediately, her voice shaking as she recounted what had happened. "They're trying to scare me," she said, anger bubbling beneath her fear. "But I'm not stopping. Not now." Mia was resolute. "You need to be careful, Rachel. Document everything, and don't go anywhere alone. They're counting on you to back down. Don't give them the satisfaction." Rachel took Mia's advice to heart, doubling down on her precautions. As she lay awake that night, the weight of it all pressed down on her. The wall felt closer, the shadows deeper. She was in uncharted territory, and the stakes had never been higher. Despite the growing tension, Rachel refused to back down. The evidence they had gathered was damning, and she knew they were on the brink of exposing a system that had allowed Mallory to operate unchecked. But as the days passed, the pressure mounted, and Rachel couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the truth finally came to light. And more importantly, would it be enough to bring Ethan Mallory to justice? The following morning, Rachel woke up to a string of missed calls from an unknown number. She hesitated before calling back, her mind racing with possibilities. When the line finally connected, a deep voice greeted her. "Rachel, my name is Agent Carter. I work with the Department of Justice." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She sat up, gripping the phone tightly. "How did you get my number?" Agent Carter's tone was calm but firm. "We've been monitoring certain individuals, and your recent activities have drawn our attention. You're digging into sensitive matters that intersect with an ongoing federal investigation. We need to meet, privately." Rachel felt a mix of apprehension and intrigue. She didn't trust anyone at this point, but the idea of a federal agent reaching out suggested they were onto something much bigger. She agreed to meet later that day at a crowded coffee shop, choosing a public space for safety. When Carter arrived, he blended seamlessly into the bustling cafe, a plainclothed man in his 40s with an unassuming demeanor. After brief introductions, he leaned in and spoke in a low voice. "You've uncovered more than you realize. Mallory isn't just a corrupt cop. He's part of a network that's been under investigation for years. Bribes, intimidation, illegal raids, it's all connected. But we haven't been able to nail him because every time we get close, someone tips him off." Rachel's mind reeled. "You think someone inside the department is protecting him?" Carter nodded. "Not just protecting, actively enabling. This isn't about one bad cop. It's a web of corruption, and Mallory is just the tip of the iceberg. The financial records you found are a key piece, but we need more. If we work together, we might be able to bring the whole operation down." Rachel didn't respond immediately. She felt torn between trusting Carter and fearing that he might be another obstacle in her path. But before she could decide, Carter leaned closer, his expression grave. "There's something else. Someone in Mallory's circle knows what you're doing. They've been tracking you for weeks. That break-in at your apartment, it wasn't random." The room seemed to close in around her. Rachel had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down her spine. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter slid a small device across the table. "This is an encrypted recorder. If you can get Mallory or any of his associates to incriminate themselves, it'll be invaluable. But be careful. If they realize what you're up to, they won't hesitate to shut you down." Rachel hesitated, the weight of the recorder in her hand feeling heavier than it should. She wasn't a spy or an investigator, just someone who wanted justice. But as she looked into Carter's eyes, she saw a glimmer of hope. If this was her chance to make a real difference, she couldn't walk away. Later that evening, Rachel met with Daniel to relay everything Carter had told her. Daniel's initial skepticism quickly gave way to determination. "If the DOJ is involved, this is bigger than we thought. But it also means we're running out of time. If Mallory knows we're onto him, he'll try to cover his tracks." As they strategized, Rachel's phone buzzed with a text for an unknown number. "Asterisk, you don't know who you're messing with. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. Asterisk." The message sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She showed it to Daniel, who immediately began tracing the number, but it led to a burner phone. "They're trying to scare you," he said, "but it also means they're desperate. That's a good thing." The next day, Rachel decided to take a calculated risk. She visited the precinct, requesting to meet Mallory under the pretense of wanting to drop her complaint. Mallory greeted her with a smug smile, clearly enjoying what he thought was her submission. "I knew you'd come around," he said, leaning back in his chair. "People like you always do." Rachel clenched her fists under the table, forcing a smile. "I realize it's not worth the fight. You've got friends in high places, and I don't stand a chance." Mallory chuckled, the arrogance in his demeanor palpable. "Smart girl. You see, it's not about who's right. It's about who has the power. And in this town, that's me." She felt the recorder in her pocket, its weight grounding her. Every word he spoke was another piece of evidence, but she couldn't push too hard or risk tipping him off. As she left the precinct, her heart pounded. She had the recording, but it wasn't enough to implicate anyone else in the network. She needed more, and time was running out. That night, Daniel called with urgent news. I've been digging into Mallory's financials again, and I found something. There's a shell company linked to his account, and it's connected to a high-ranking official in the department. This goes all the way to the top. Rachel's stomach dropped. The realization that their fight wasn't just against Mallory, but an entire system of corruption left her reeling. But instead of deterring her, it steeled her resolve. "We need to expose this," she said, her voice firm. "Not just Mallory, all of it." As they planned their next move, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. And while she didn't know what lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't backing down. Rachel and Daniel worked through the night, piecing together their evidence. The financial records, the audio recordings, and the connections they'd uncovered painted a damning picture. It wasn't just Mallory, it was a network of officers, politicians, and businessmen, all profiting from a system designed to protect the powerful. The weight of what they had in their hands felt almost unbearable, but they couldn't stop now. Daniel found a contact at a local news station, a journalist named Maya, who had built a reputation for exposing corruption. Maya was hesitant at first, warning them about the risks of going public without airtight evidence. But once she saw the documents and heard the recordings, her skepticism turned to resolve. "This is big," she said. "If we play this right, we can take them all down. But we need to move fast." Rachel, Daniel, and Maya planned an expose that would air the following evening. Maya promised to keep their identities anonymous until they were sure the system couldn't retaliate. The three of them worked tirelessly to prepare, knowing they were racing against the clock. But just as they were finalizing the story, Rachel's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something told her to answer. The voice on the other end was cold and calculated. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think you can outsmart us?" Rachel froze, gripping the phone tightly. "Who is this?" she demanded. "You don't need to know who I am," the voice continued. "But I know who you are. I know what you're planning. If you value your life, you'll drop this now." The call ended abruptly, leaving Rachel shaken. She relayed the threat to Daniel and Maya, but instead of backing down, it only strengthened their resolve. They contacted Agent Carter, who promised to provide protection and assured them the DOJ was preparing to act. The day of the expose arrived, and Rachel found herself more anxious than ever. The news station's security was tight, and Agent Carter had stationed plainclothes officers nearby. As the broadcast began, Rachel and Daniel watched from a safe location, their hearts pounding. Maya presented the story with precision, walking viewers through the web of corruption, naming names, and playing snippets of the recordings. The impact was immediate. Social media exploded with outrage, and calls flooded the police department and City Hall, demanding answers. By the time the broadcast ended, it was clear that this was a turning point. But as Rachel allowed herself a moment of relief, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number, but the words sent a chill down her spine. Asterisk. This isn't over. Asterisk. Before she could process it, Agent Carter called. "Rachel, we've got a problem. Mallory's gone. We think he's trying to flee, but he's desperate. You need to be careful." Hours later, Mallory's car was found abandoned near the city limits, but he was nowhere to be seen. The DOJ issued warrants for his arrest and for others implicated in the scandal. But as the days passed, Mallory remained elusive. Then a week later, Rachel received a package at her door. Inside was a single flash drive with a note that read, "Asterisk, you missed something. Asterisk." Daniel quickly plugged the drive into his computer, and what they found was shocking. It was a video recording of Mallory in an undisclosed location, speaking directly to the camera. "They think they've won, but the game isn't over," he said, his tone defiant. "I've got insurance, enough to take everyone down with me. If you're watching this, it means they've already started their cover-up. But I'm not going quietly." The video ended abruptly, leaving Rachel and Daniel stunned. They knew the fight wasn't over, but this time they had the public on their side. The broadcast had ignited a firestorm, and while Mallory was on the run, The DOJ and independent investigators were unraveling the rest of the network. For Rachel, the journey had been harrowing, but she realized that standing up for what was right often came with risks. As she sat in her apartment, scrolling through messages of support from strangers across the country, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle against corruption was far from over, but she wasn't alone anymore. And with each step forward, she knew she was helping to create a world where justice could finally prevail.